This is the second in the Prezi series, which tends to resemble the logic model that you will have to use for your logic model speech. And rather than talking about logic models or proposals generally, we're going to approach an issue of hostile audiences using this program planning logic model. Now, it's not exactly planning a program. What you have to do for your logic model is a little more specific, but this should give you some good places to start in thinking about not just how to build a logic model, but how to build one for an audience, and in some cases, building something for a hostile audience. We're going to talk a little bit about what a hostile audience is and how to deal within a hostile audience, and we always want to start with those desired results, that thing you want at the end. So what you really want to do is you want to have audience of various types that are managed. You want to have your speech go smoothly, and a hostile audience might get in the way of that. You want to think that some of your purposes, goals for speaking are met. As we talked about with the teaching one, and we talked about with the very first lecture, there are times where the audience may not be with you, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're hostile. There can be other factors. And we want to make sure that our apprehension's not too high. When we know the audience is against us, we tend to be a little bit more nervous. Sometimes that nervousness goes into increased practice or preparation, but in some cases we tend to skip that and we tend to become much more defensive. And so what we want to talk about are some of the problems and issues raised by a hostile audience, some of the tools we have to deal with it, and some of the things we may need to know. So we start off with our problem, our issues, that hostile audiences are difficult to convince and they can affect our confidence. A hostile audience is unlikely to listen to our arguments. They're not likely to hear us out or give us that benefit of the doubt. In many cases, they may engage in what's called script writing or defensive listening. Script writing is where someone listens to a speaker, hears part of what they say, or maybe makes a quick judgment and decides that they're going to write the speech for them. A speaker might give a point that someone doesn't like and say, okay, well, I disagree with that, so I assume they'll say this, and this, and I disagree with all of that, rather than listening to what the speaker is actually saying. And this kind of defensive listening, in other words, listening in order to counter, or listening in order to get a point across, can be difficult in persuading an audience, but the most extreme ones may disrupt or try to heckle you, and that can be very challenging as well. But not just in getting our point across. Hostile audiences can affect our confidence, they may hurt our feelings, they make us appear incompetent or feel incompetent, but most importantly, they cause us to lose control of a situation. When we lose control of a situation, we're not the person in command of the room anymore. We're not leading the audience on that magical journey. We feel like our time is being wasted, we feel like we are looking foolish, and it isolates us from others, which is part of our big fear with communication. To get over this fear of a hostile audience, we need to go with what we have and what we need to know. We start with our assets. We have the ability to understand different kinds of people. Your education has hopefully helped you learn that people are different from you and how to understand them and how to think like they think. If you have enough time to plan a message strategy and you know your audience is likely to be hostile in advance, that can help. And if you're able to adapt or change your message. Now, this doesn't mean you need to adapt or change the core of your message, the most important purpose of it, but you may need to in some cases, or you may just need to change the coding and how you approach something. And what you need to know, and what you'll hopefully get from this lecture, is some knowledge from different audience types and some examples, and a deeper exploration of audiences as groups and audience members as individual members. So we'll start off with some of our assumptions. One assumption we have to have of a hostile audience is that they're capable of change. In other words, the audience that comes in loving you could wind up not loving you by the end. The audience that comes in hating you might not hate you by the end. If they're not capable of change and they're already hostile to you, there's no point in talking to them. In some cases, in professional situations where you have to deliver the message, they may not care if the audience is actually receptive. They may just care if the message got delivered. But we have to think that emotions have momentum. An audience that starts hostile may become increasingly hostile. But an audience that stops that hostility, if you're able to change that momentum, you might not get every person on your side, you may not get every person to agree with you, but you might at least get heard out. And we have to think about some things that some people will always be hostile. There are some audience members that will never get along and never be receptive to your message. And when we recognize that, we understand that treating everyone the same is not always the right thing to do. Once we've gone through those assumptions, we can look at some different strategies. And we want to sort out two different kinds of audiences that can be difficult to deal with. The hostile audience is the audience that's against a position, and the apathetic audience is the audience that doesn't really care about the issue. Now, I've seen and encountered both audiences. Now, from my perspective, we tend to fear the hostile audience the most, but the apathetic is the most difficult audience. If you want to see the best example of an apathetic audience, go to any lecture here on ASU campus during the fall or the spring. Go around the room, take a look around, and whenever you take a look around, see how many people you think are there for extra credit only. These are the people who are trying to go get the extra credit, sign the sheet, and leave. They are not there because they care about the lecturer or position or topic or anything else. These audiences are the most difficult to speak to. They're more difficult to speak to in some cases than the hostile audience, who at least is familiar with the issue, cares about the issue. They show up caring about the issue. So if nothing else, what you have in common with the audience is that you both care enough about the issue to show up. So when you both care about the issue, you should focus on those points of agreement. You may need to acknowledge their point of view, and you may need to work for a limited change. In other words, maybe not all the change you want, but all the change you feel the audience is capable of doing. Again, it's about audience-centeredness, not speaker-centeredness. When the apathetic audience, you need to really focus on grabbing their attention. You need to focus on their personal needs rather than any complexities of their argument, and a lot of your work is not going to be getting them to do the big action or do the big thing, but it's getting them to care about the issue, getting the issue to matter to that audience. And when we think about those influential factors, there are things that will influence hostile audiences, apathetic audiences, and things that influence both. When we think about things that influence both, they can be bad rooms, bad circumstances, time, putting the speech after dinner, before dinner, loud noises. These are things that might make an audience more hostile or more likely to check out and become apathetic. Apathy tends to be about a perceived irrelevance and their motives for attendance. Again, going back to that extra credit seeking student at an ASU lecture. The apathetic student is more likely to think, well, this topic's not relevant for me, I'm just here for the extra credit, so they're more likely to become more apathetic. So as a speaker, you need to show how it's relevant to them by going to their personal life and trying to figure out what their motives for attending might be and work from there. With hostility, maybe their interests are opposed. In other words, they have a position that's opposed to you rather than they're opposed to you personally. It's good to sort out one from the other. The person who's opposed to your interest, you need to convince them on a level of interest, which means you need to work on the level of argumentation. If they're opposed to you personally, you may need to find areas of common ground and commonality. There may not be a lot of benefit in trying to focus on the argument if they're opposed to you personally, but you may need to work for much more limited change when they are opposed to you personally. With all of these factors in mind, we have some strategies to help you manage a hostile audience. When we think about hostile audiences or apathetic audiences, we want to go back to that how to teach people things. And remember that not everyone shows up engaged. Not every audience member is going to be won over. You don't need to treat them all the same. But if you're able to engage with the audience, you're not assuming too much. You believe they're capable of some kind of change. You focus on those areas of agreement, they grab their attention, focus on their personal needs, you're more likely to be successful. And even if you're not successful in convincing the most hostile audience members, you have to remember that there's members of the audience watching how you deal with the most hostile audience members. So when those audience members watching the most hostile audience members are watching you, you could convince those other people as well.